Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Lawton. I'm the Associate for Youth and Family Ministries at Trinity Episcopal Church in Southport, Connecticut, and we are really excited to be able to welcome you to this presentation tonight, How Ageism Harms Us All, presented by Ashton Applewhite. We're so excited to have you here with us tonight. I'm also your Zoom host and moderator for this evening, and I just want to touch base on a couple of things about what to expect this evening. This is a webinar format, so you're probably noticing that you're only seeing 4 people on your screen instead of the 40 of us that are here on this call right now, and that's how it should be. So it's just a different format than a typical Zoom meeting. As the presentation's going along, if you've got any questions that you might want to ask Ashton later on for our Q&A, I'll ask you to hold on to them until we get to the Q&A part. And then you're going to use the chat function, which if you're on a desktop, you just scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom window and you'll see a button that says chat. Click on that. A new window will open up on your right-hand side and you just type your question in there. Make sure that the little drop-down menu that says to : is set to the panelists. And that way we can all of us see it. And the last thing to note is that this presentation is being recorded. So if you do ask a question, you won't be seen or heard, but we will read it out hopefully. And so just to bear that in mind as we go through the evening. So thank you very much. Thanks to the folks who are sharing where they're from. We've got people here from Oklahoma, from Brooklyn, from Sacramento. That's really exciting. We're so glad to have you here tonight. And I'm going to introduce you to Mark Grayson, who is the director of the Trinity Spiritual Center in Southport, Connecticut. Mark.
Thanks, Rob. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us at Trinity Spiritual Center for the third in a series of conversations this spring on contemporary issues that deeply impact our lives. Our first conversation last January was with Dane and Constance Perry on the legacy of the slave trade in New England. Our second discussion was on reclaiming grace in the face of adversity with the MacArthur genius, author, actor, activist, Anna Deavere Smith. And tonight we're thrilled to be talking with Ashton Applewhite, whose main stage TED Talk about the harm that ageism causes has been viewed by 1.6 million people. I'm also pleased to announce that our speakers for next fall and spring will focus on an expanding slate of topics, including the dominance-based culture of masculinity that is causing so many problems in the world today, and women's issues that urgently need our attention, and ancient wisdom traditions and contemplative practices that can improve our daily lives. And we'll also continue our conversations on race and new perspectives on aging. So let's get on with the main event of this evening. For those of you who might not know Ashton's work, she's a highly visible activist in the global anti-ageism movement. She's testified at the UN, the Library of Congress, and is regularly interviewed as an expert on ageism. She's published an excellent book that I highly recommend to everyone read. It's chock full of information and insight. It's entitled "This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism," and boy, is it. The Washington Post has named it one of the top 100 books to read at any age. She runs a blog, Yo, Is This Ageist?, which offers advice as to how we can avoid some of the habits of speech and mind that advanced ageism. And I should also add, she's also had 4 books of jokes on the New York Times bestseller list at the same time under the pseudonym Blanche Knott. Some have dubbed her the Dorothy Parker of ageism for her pithy, funny, and memorable public statements on the topic. So I expect our conversation tonight to be pretty lively. We're first going to watch her TED Talk And then she and I will have a 20 to 25-minute discussion on ageism, at the end of which she'll answer questions that you pose in the chat function. So be sure to fire away as the evening proceeds. And with that, Rob, roll tape.
Just as a heads up, it does begin with an ad, so.
And then I learned that only 4% of every person in this room is going to become older. And most of us are scared stiff at the prospect. How does that word make you feel? I used to feel the same way. What was I most worried about? Ending up drooling in some grim institutional hallway. And then I learned that only 4% of older Americans are living in nursing homes, and the percentage is dropping. What else was I worried about? Dementia. Turns out that most of us can think just fine to the end. Dementia rates are dropping too. The real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss. I also figured that old people were depressed because they were old and they were going to die soon. It turns out that the longer people live, the less they fear dying, and that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-curve of happiness, and it's been borne out by dozens of studies around the world. You don't have to be a Buddhist or a billionaire. The curve is a function of the way aging itself affects the brain. So I started feeling a lot better about getting older, and I started obsessing about why so few people know these things. The reason is ageism, discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. We experience it anytime someone assumes we're too old for something, instead of finding out who we are and what we're capable of, or too young. Ageism cuts both ways. All isms are socially constructed ideas: racism, sexism, homophobia, and that means we make them up, and they can change over time. All these prejudices pit us against each other to maintain the status quo, like auto workers in the US competing against auto workers in Mexico instead of organizing for better wages. We know it's not okay to allocate resources by race or by sex. Why should it be okay to weigh the needs of the young against the old? All prejudice relies on othering, seeing a group of people as other than ourselves, other race, other religion, other nationality. The strange thing about ageism, that other is us. Ageism feeds on denial, our reluctance to acknowledge that we are going to become that older person. It's denial when we try to pass for younger, or when we believe in anti-aging products, or when we feel like our bodies are betraying us simply because they are changing. Why on earth do we stop celebrating the ability to adapt and grow as we move through life? Why should aging well mean struggling to look and move like younger versions of ourselves? It's embarrassing to be called out as older until we quit being embarrassed about it. And it's not healthy to go through life dreading our futures. The sooner we get off this hamster wheel of age denial, the better off we are. Stereotypes are always a mistake, of course, but especially when it comes to age, because the longer we live, the more different from one another we become, right? Think about it. And yet, we tend to think of everyone in a retirement home as the same age, old. When they can span 4 decades, can you imagine thinking that way about a group of people between the ages of 20 and 60? When you get to a party, do you head for people your own age? Have you ever grumbled about entitled millennials? Have you ever rejected a haircut or a relationship or an outing because it's not age appropriate? For adults, there's no such thing. All these behaviors are ageist. We all do them, and we can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it. Nobody's born ageist, but it starts in early childhood, around the same time attitudes towards race and gender start to form, because negative messages about late life bombard us from the media and popular culture at every turn, right? Wrinkles are ugly. Old people are pathetic. It's sad to be old. Look at Hollywood. A survey of recent Best Picture nominations found that only 12% of speaking or named characters were age 60 and up, and many of them were portrayed as impaired. Older people can be the most ageist of all because we've had a lifetime to internalize these messages, and we've never thought to challenge them. I had to acknowledge it and stop colluding. Senior moment quips, for example, I stopped making them when it dawned on me that when I lost the car keys in high school, I didn't call it a junior moment. Like I stopped blaming my sore knee on being 64. My other knee doesn't hurt, and it's just as old. We are all worried about some aspect of getting older, whether running out of money, getting sick, ending up alone, and those fears are legitimate and real. But what never dawns on most of us is that the experience of reaching old age can be better or worse depending on the culture in which it takes place. It is not having a vagina that makes life harder for women, it's sexism. It's not loving a man that makes life harder for gay guys, it's homophobia. And it is not the passage of time that makes getting older so much harder than it has to be, it is ageism. When labels are hard to read, or there's no handrail, or we can't open the damn jar, we blame ourselves, our failure to age successfully, instead of the ageism that makes those natural transitions shameful and the discrimination that makes those barriers acceptable. You can't make money off satisfaction, but shame and fear create markets, and capitalism always needs new markets. Who says wrinkles are ugly? The multi-billion-dollar skincare industry. Who says perimenopause and low T and mild cognitive impairment are medical conditions? The trillion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. The more clearly we see these forces at work, the easier it is to come up with alternative, more positive, and more accurate narratives. Aging is not a problem to be fixed or a disease to be cured. It is a natural, powerful, lifelong process that unites us all. Changing the culture is a tall order, I know that, but culture is fluid. Look at how much the position of women has changed in my lifetime, or the incredible strides that the gay rights movement has made in just a few decades, right? Look at gender. We used to think of it as a binary, male or female, and now we understand it's a spectrum. It is high time to ditch the old-young binary too. There is no line in the sand between old and young after which it's all downhill. And the longer we wait to challenge that idea, the more damage it does to ourselves and our place in the world, like in the workforce, where age discrimination is rampant. In Silicon Valley, engineers are getting Botoxed and hair plugged before key interviews, and these are skilled white men in their 30s, so imagine the effects further down the food chain. The personal and economic consequences are devastating. Not one stereotype about older workers holds up under scrutiny. Companies aren't adaptable and creative because their employees are young. They're adaptable and creative despite it. Companies... We know that diverse companies aren't just better places to work, they work better. And just like race and sex, age is a criterion for diversity. A growing body of fascinating research shows that attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. When we talk to older people like this, or call them sweetie or young lady, it's called elder speak, they appear to instantly age, walking and talking less competently. People with more positive feelings towards aging walk faster, they do better on memory tests, they heal quicker, and they live longer. Even with brains full of plaques and tangles, some people stayed sharp to the end. What did they have in common? A sense of purpose. And what's the biggest obstacle to having a sense of purpose in late life? A culture that tells us that getting older means shuffling off stage. That's why the World Health Organization is developing a global anti-ageism initiative to extend not just lifespan, but health span. Women experience the double whammy of ageism and sexism, so we experience aging differently. There's a double standard at work here, shocker. The notion that aging enhances men and devalues women. Women reinforce this double standard when we compete to stay young. Another punishing and losing proposition. Does any woman in this room really believe that she is a lesser version, less interesting, less fun in bed, less valuable than the woman she once was? This discrimination affects our health, our well-being, and our income, and the effects add up over time. They are further compounded by race and by class, which is why everywhere in the world, the poorest of the poor are old women of color. What's the takeaway from that map? By 2050, 1 out of 5 of us, almost 2 billion people, will be age 60 and up. Longevity is a fundamental hallmark of human progress. All these older people represent a vast, unprecedented, and untapped market. And yet, capitalism and urbanization have propelled age bias into every corner of the globe, from Switzerland, where elders fare the best, to Afghanistan, which sits at the bottom of the global Age Watch Index. Half of the world's countries aren't mentioned on that list because we don't bother to collect data on almost 2 million people because they're no longer young. Almost 2/3 of people over 60 around the world say they have trouble accessing health care. Almost 3/4 say their income doesn't cover basic services like food, water, electricity, and decent housing. Is this the world we want our children, who may well live to be 100, to inherit? Everyone, all ages, all genders, all nationalities, is old or future old. And unless we put an end to it, ageism will oppress us all. And that makes it a perfect target for collective advocacy. Why add another ism to the list when so many, racism in particular, call out for action? Here's the thing: we don't have to choose. When we make the world a better place to grow old in, we make it a better place in which to be from somewhere else, to have a disability, to be queer, to be non-rich, to be non-white. And when we show up at all ages for whatever cause matters most to us, save the whales, save the democracy, we not only make that effort more effective, we dismantle ageism in the process. Longevity is here to stay. A movement to end ageism is underway. I'm in it, and I hope you will join me. Thank you. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Well,
I'm really glad I never have to do that again.
Yeah, exactly.
It was terrifying.
I can imagine. But what a tour de force. I mean,
Thanks.
totally amazing. And no wonder you got a standing ovation.
Of course, like I think of all the things I did wrong and the things that are blah, 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 but that's life.
Well, nobody else notices it but you. So
I know.
it's
That percentage, 4% of people over 65 in nursing homes, it's down to less than 1%.
really.
Yep, just in these 5 years.
Wow. Wow. Well, I can't wait to dive into this conversation. I have to say that, you know, there's just so much material in your book and all the interviews you've done and on the website that I was at a complete loss where to begin this conversation or how to organize it. And I think what I'm going to propose is that just to give us a path through the material, I'd like to just kind of focus on 5 myths that kind of caught my attention, and talk a little bit more deeply about them, debunk them for everybody. Because I think if we could do anything, is you just sort of get people equipped with sort of key messages that they really need to hold in their heart about aging. And then I think it might also be useful to kind of take a closer look at some of the cultural biases that we are all unfortunately contending with.
We are.
And then the last thing I'd love to do is just kind of hear more about what's going on in the sort of aging movement, so that those of us who might be interested in participating have an opportunity to know what we can do.
Fantastic.
So let me start with the myth that is the most terrifying for me. And that is the myth of the cognitive decline that we're going to experience as we grow old. For whatever reason, that's the one that really just completely terrifies me. And what was so interesting to read in the book was that, in fact, the vast majority of us will not have the experience of a serious mental decline. And that further, that even if we were to experience some, what is it called? intracranial arterial plaque.
Mild cognitive impairment is the, and there's a whole bunch of people that think that's just another label made up to scare you so that you'll spend money buying products or doing Sudoku that isn't really going to help you.
Well,
I mean,
the thing that was really amazing to me was that the brain is actually trying to build cognitive reserve.
Yeah, I mean, your brain stays plastic. I mean, about 20% physical decline is inevitable. There are only two inevitable bad things about aging, but one is that people you've known all your life are going to die, and some part of your body is going to fall apart. Cognitive decline is not inevitable. About 20% of the population escapes it completely. And we all know some of those really sharp 90-year-olds, right? Most of us are going to lose processing speeds, memory, remembering the name of the movie that you saw with what's her name. But that doesn't mean that tomorrow you're not going to remember, what a movie is, right? The two points there. For most of us, yes, you can't remember when you stood up, what the hell it was you were stood up for, but it doesn't get worse. That doesn't mean that you're on some, hideous downward trajectory. Sometimes I think of myself as being in the two sides of the story business. Dementia rates are falling fast. How come we never hear about that? And the study that I would love mentioning, which likewise came out since the TED Talk, much of it done by Becca Levy at Yale, not too far from where you are, is that people with, I say, fact rather than fear-based attitudes towards aging, because if you say positive attitudes, it makes it sound like you're putting the scary stuff under the rug. Scary stuff is real. But people with fact rather than fear-based attitudes towards aging are less likely to get Alzheimer's, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease. Isn't that amazing?
It is. Yeah. I just love this stuff. I mean, it's well, the other thing that you mentioned, and I guess maybe there's some hope for some of the people on the call.
Probably not.
Is that there's some mental proficiencies that continue to sort of evolve and mature in our 50s. And I had never, I'd spent a lot of time in the neurosciences professionally a couple decades ago. I had not heard that before. I knew that the brain was plastic, but that there's some faculties that actually continue to strengthen.
Yeah, or when we lose capacity, but we gain other things. It's a trade-off.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's fascinating, and I'm grateful that maybe there's hope. So a second myth that caught my attention is, one of the sort of beliefs that we have is that as we get older, we're increasingly unable to handle sort of emotionally charged situations. There's that sort of image of, olders floundering around trying to sort of find their way through some challenges, and yet the research is completely in the opposite.
Completely. Thanks for that softball. Older people enjoy better mental health than young or middle-aged because there's actually a brand new study that just came out from the Stanford Longevity Center in the last few weeks, which looked at older people's resilience during COVID. And, whatever I'm about to say is not true of anyone. There is also, high suicide rates among the old. So I don't mean to, put a, glossy picture over this, but when you have lived a long time, it is easier to take a long view, to have more perspective and to put things in perspective. And so that's incredibly interesting. And we become more resilient at adapting and better at, this is interesting, better at living in the present moment, especially in our 80s, 70s and 80s. The older we are, the better people get. It's why people fear dying less, which was completely counterintuitive to me. I thought the Grim Reaper must get closer and closer and it would just get worse and worse. That's not how it works. people don't want to die. They really don't want to die in pain, but it doesn't preoccupy them. It preoccupies them less. We get better at living in the moment, which is what kids do because they don't know how to do anything else. And, you know, savoring the present, even if all the things that were once available to us are not anymore, because that's part of that. And that is why the very old and very young experience the highest levels of happiness.
Interesting.
It's really interesting. If you told me 15 years ago I'd be fascinated by age and aging, I would have said, why do I want to think about something yucky and depressing? You know, really, I was so skeptical heading into this.
Well, actually, that was a question that I wanted to ask you, and I'll move on to the next myth after this. But how did you get into this in the first place?
I mean, I have no background, no training, no professional affiliations, but I am an amateur scholar, I guess. I mean, I research, and let me say that every single data point in my book and in that talk is backed up by blue chip science and, you know, readily available science. I didn't cherry pick any data. That's why I don't love the phrase, you know, positive aging or whatever. This is not happy talk. This is what the data show. I was in my mid-50s. I realized I was somewhere between apprehensive and terrified at the thought of getting old, which is clearly happening. And I just started to learn about longevity, and the facts with which I started that TED Talk with over 10 years later, I encountered within months, if not weeks. And it was like, why don't we know this stuff? We don't know this stuff because there are powerful social and economic forces that want us to be afraid, that want us to stay divided, that want us to spend a lot of money on crap we don't need.
Yeah.
That would be the very short answer.
Well, hats off to you for pouring all your heart and soul into this. I think the next thing I want to tackle is the issue of the sort of the fact that we will experience some diminishment of our physical abilities as we age. And there are a couple things that really struck me in the book. One was, I always thought that how we age physically was very much determined by our genes. And you hear that all the time.
Yeah.
But the data point that I remember was that it's only like 25%, and that everything else is all behavioral and environmental. And that, in fact, if that's the case, and it apparently is, then at any time, even tiny little adjustments in our behavior and environment can actually have a material effect on our health.
Yeah, 20, I've seen 30, I've seen 25. I've never seen lower than 25. But again, when I first encountered that, because everyone said, oh, my grandmother lived to 110, so I'm going to, you know, make it there. You know, and of course, when you talk about environmental factors, that's where socioeconomic status plays an enormous role. It's why we see, you know, it's why we see such enormous higher rates of death from COVID of Black and Brown people because of those factors. But another factor that I think gets not talked about enough is luck. You know, we have this idea that if we think right, eat right, do enough kale, especially those of us who are lucky enough to, you know, have a fair amount of social and economic privilege, which I certainly do, that somehow there's a right way to do it or a best way to do it. And sure, there are good practices that we can engage in, but there's also just plain luck. And I think it's really important to remember that and be humble about how much control we do have over our circumstances, which is scary and also liberating.
Yeah. And another thing that I loved your whole philosophy, I think it is, that we really need to come to grips with the physical realities that we experience, that we, you know, that and develop our lives within the constraints, whatever they really are, not the ones that we imagine or the ones that, you know, that we think are in the future or whatever, but that we really, it's like accepting and enjoying and building our life.
Yeah, let's start with not denying it, you know, and you know, these are huge, but not being ashamed by this loss of function. Why should waking up a day older be something to be ashamed of? It's really important to remember that today's constraints may not be the same ones you have tomorrow, and that it's not all downhill. Physical, I mean, when my daughter tore her ACL and she's hobbling around, I'm like, oh, a reminder that we get better from things. My weak spot is my musculoskeletal system, and I'm always doing PT for that seriously does hurt for some part of my body. And then I, lift the goddamn weights and whatever, and it gets better. And, it's a push pull. Where do you push back? We can continue to do the things that matter the most to us to the end, but we may not do them in the way we did when we were 20. Some things we do better. I think sex is actually an example of that for a lot of people. Some things we can't, if your thing is extreme sports, you are not going to be able to ski that black diamond probably when you're, in your 70s, but you can still ski. We have to continuously push where we want to push and accept where we either are able to or have to. It's a dance.
Yeah. I think that's such an important concept, because I know for myself, I've been sort of on this treadmill of trying to maintain whatever it is that I had when I was 45, or, and it's a hopeless battle that way. I mean, you're setting yourself up for failure. It's never going to happen.
Let's not forget the class bias, too. A lot of these things are available only to the reasonably well-off. Gyms, sushi, leisure. There's a huge class bias in the whole doctrine of successful aging, active aging. If you are not, can't do those things, it doesn't strip your life of meaning, and it certainly does not strip your life of value.
Yeah. Well, and just to close off on all the physical side aspects of aging, because we could go on and on, I could at least forever. There was one other statement that you made that I think is really important, and that is that we're living longer and healthier lives. And that I thought I saw something that said that the period of feeling disabled is later and shorter for a lot of people than it was before. Am I getting that all wrong?
I know that the furrow is not because I think you're getting it wrong. It's complicated, I mean, think of the massive number of people who are experiencing and will continue to experience long-term disability because of COVID, right? At all entering into this. I've been thinking a lot since COVID about the intersection between ageism and ableism, which is discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of our physical and cognitive capacity. And the two are deeply intertwined. A lot of what we think of as ageism is actually ableism. We cannot keep everything functioning the way it was. It does set us up to fail, and it's expensive. But what we need to embark on together is stripping these changes of the stigma, and and acknowledging the scary stuff too. There's so much doctrine out there about successful aging, right? And what you see almost exclusively from AARP and a lot of pro-aging sites is it really means it's this doctrine of not aging, of keeping our heads in the sand, of pushing not all the bad stuff is inevitable, but some of it is pretending like I'm just shoving it off out of my screen. But then you have to deal with it eventually, and it's even more scary because we've tried to bury it under the rug. So educating yourself it's free. If you look at my website, where I've been thinking out loud in blog form all these years, and the book is not that expensive, and there's a lot of other people to learn from besides me.
And just because you mentioned the website, it's thischairrocks.com.
thischairrocks.com.
Yeah.
And I will just make a quick plug for another website, which I started with two colleagues a couple of years ago, the Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse, because movements need tools and best practices and ways to share them. So it is a place with hundreds of free vetted anti-ageism resource videos, consciousness raising guides, books, speakers, podcasts, whatever. Everything is free except the books.
Great. So I want to go back to something you said earlier, And I honestly have to say, when I first looked at it, I'm like, oh, come on, this is a bunch of hooey. Because,
That's
it's
that's
all-
what I thought about when I encountered the U curve. I was like, oh, great. They cornered two 80-year-olds, gave them a cookie and said, how are you doing? And then I thought, well, it must be true if you're healthy. It must be true if you're wealthy. And it obtains across class, across marital status.
That's great. So here's the thing that I was looking at thinking, really? But it's so cool. I want to make sure that we talk about it. And that is that it's kind of like the power of having a positive attitude about aging. That I think I saw somewhere that it can add 7.5 years to your life.
Yeah,
And
that's
there's all that positive thinking thing out there that you're kind of like,
it's
but-
real. The mind-body connection is real.
but it's real. I mean, they've documented it down to the cellular level.
That's a famous study done by Becca Levy at Yale, and the media does put it as a positive attitude, which I say a fact rather than fear-based attitude, because I don't want it to seem like if you don't think about the scary stuff, then you'll be fine, because accepting and acknowledging does mean accepting. Embrace is a big ask, but what I do really want us to do is not be in denial about age and aging. And it also sets us up for a much better end of life. Talking about getting older paves the way to talking about the fact that you might even be mortal, right? And it's just, when you talk about these things, you do defang them. They become less frightening, and it paves the way for ongoing conversations, which that one definitely needs to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's ironic, right? So the fear of aging actually shortens your life.
Right. The more afraid we are of cognitive decline. If when you can't find your glasses, you think, oh, Alzheimer's by Thursday, that anxiety, which is acute and real, I'm not laughing at you. It's my biggest fear too. But that anxiety that makes you more vulnerable to exactly what you fear. The scientists at Yale theorize that this more positive attitude acts as a buffer against stress. We all know stress is a killer, cardio disease, whatever. And what generates that stress? Living in an ageist society, right? That tells us that we are useless, that we are invisible, that we are not valued members of society. And that, that's why my mission is a big one. We need a grassroots movement like the women's movement to challenge the way we think about age and aging, starting between our ears.
So one last myth before I go on to the sort of the cultural biases, and that's just it's really a set of myths about the older worker. And there's just this sort of convention that once you reach a certain age, you're not digital, you're slower, it's just a whole list of things that allegedly are true about workers. And the chapter that I was says that basically none of them are true.
None of them are true.
There's like studies after studies. So why is it that companies still, when you get to be like 50 or whatever, you start to get onto this list, and you can expect to be like maybe in jeopardy of being the first one out,
The short answer, capitalism. If they can force out high-paid workers, then they can, save money. But the same forces that older workers are up against, younger workers are now too. I mean, my kids are millennials, and they face, they had the Great Recession. They are now hostage to a gig economy where no one has the pension anymore. So it's really important not to think about this labor market stuff in terms of old versus young. They're one of the pernicious myths is that the greedy old people hang on to jobs so young people can't get started. Typically, olders and youngers don't compete for the same jobs. That's a fallacy called the fallacy of the lump of labor, which economists have debunked countless times. But the media seizes on conflict You know, it always has in any domain, not just about aging, because conflict sells papers. You know, who's gonna click on a story about, you know, most of us muddling along in the middle just fine, which is of course the true story. So it's really important not to buy any old versus young thinking in any domain, especially in the workforce. If there's not enough jobs, sure, older people and younger people and everyone in between is going to compete for it. But that's a labor market problem, not a too many old people problem. Yeah. Not a single stereotype about older people. It might take us longer to learn something, but not if it attaches to something we learned before. And if that's what it took to keep food on the table, I could master nuclear physics. You know, we learn what we need to learn.
Right, right. So do you think—
Don't ask me to master nuclear physics.
No, don't worry. So do you think that COVID might present the opportunity to rethink some of our assumptions about, because you know, allegedly we're reorganizing work as a result of COVID right now, that things are not going to go back to the way they were. So is it possible that within the context of, okay, how are we going to do things new, there's an opportunity for the, you know, companies to rethink the role of the older workforce?
Sure. I mean,
enterprise
remotely is fantastic for older people and people with disabilities, which are different groups, but you know, they intersect more and more in the Venn diagram of life over time. People with disabilities have been asking for decades for accommodations to work from home, accommodations that magically became possible once the health of the general public was at risk. So it is incumbent on everyone to make sure that those changes stay permanent. I think COVID, paired with Black Lives Matter, has put a zillion things into play that are really interesting, which are not just about age and aging. You know, a lot of people were like, oh, it's made ageism worse and ableism worse. It didn't make them worse. Black Lives Matter didn't make racism worse. It exposed what has been there all along. And I think with, you know, in my opinion, racism deserves extraordinary, and when I was happy to hear you reference it, efforts, because of the uniquely ugly way it is embedded in American history. But COVID has also exposed the intersectional nature of vulnerability itself. The long-term care industry is doing some serious soul searching. I mean, given the death toll in long-term care, they damn well should be. But I do think we have an opportunity to build on an awareness of, you know, thinking differently in all these domains, the workforce, the healthcare industry. I think a ton of stuff is up for grabs, and I'm not happy about the human cost and the burden borne by Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. But I do think we have an incredible opportunity, and that it's incumbent on those of us with more privilege to try really hard to rise to that challenge.
Yes, yes. So, okay, so now I'm just going to move to a couple cultural biases that also totally fascinated me in your book, and I absolutely believe that they that they do impact negatively how we age. One is that you point out, and I, you know, guilty as charged, that we
are all guilty as charged,
that we're a nation of doers, and that, you know, and that we tend, that our identities are sort of wrapped up in our earning power and our physical prowess and all that, and that what we really need to try and do is focus more on being. And I have to say, okay, this is Trinity Spiritual Center, so, you know, this would come as no surprise that
say Protestant work ethic. Hello, Trinity.
Yeah. So we have a lot of doers here, but then, you know, Eastern religious practice, they always say, you know, be, don't do. So I'm just, you know, talk to me a little bit more about what you
think. You probably know more about this than I do. You know, certainly a characteristic, this is not my expertise, but of Eastern religions is to see life as a circle. Yeah. And in the West, it's got to be up, 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 bigger, better, faster, you know, and that does not serve us well. I don't think it serves us particularly well as human beings, and it certainly serves us poorly as we age, and the ways in which we define ourselves need to shift. So, you know, the Protestant work ethic and capitalism, you know, where the wealth of the value of a human being is tethered to how much money they make, you know, which even, and there's ways to work, even in that constrained sense, older people do so much unpaid work, volunteerism. We do most of the looking after other older people and disabled people, which has enormous value that's never tallied up, right? And even if we're watching a grandchild so their parents can go make money, you know, we contribute in a zillion ways, but I would never want to reduce the value of humans as a whole or older people to how much money they make or help other people make.
Well, and it's really problematic when you define yourself by what you do, because then when you no longer have a job, you know, you lose your identity and you lose your social network. I mean,
especially men. This is one, I mean, ageism disproportionately affects women, but for a lot of men, the work is their strongest source of social connections and perhaps more of their identities. This may be changing as we inch our way to gender parity in the workforce. But you know, women tend to be the custodians of more social networks and have other ways of measuring and you know, establishing our value and our social standing and social identity.
Well, and that really gets me to the other cultural bias that I think you point out so well, and we really need to think about. And it also comes back to Trinity in a strange way. But, you know, the fact that we kind of prize rugged individualism and independence, and
they're related, of course.
Right. And then as we age, we really need to understand the interdependence of things and the need to be building our networks so that we thrive. And
I mean, I would even take the as we age out of that, because obviously babies need help with everything. We need help lifelong. As we move through life, we may have less control over the kind of help we need and when we need it, but we don't suddenly go. I mean, there's all these false binaries. I mean, I floundered for quite a while. There was a really several year period where I just did not know my way, and my working title at 3 o'clock in the morning was "Binaries are bad." We do not go. There is no old young binary. There is no mobile immobile binary. There is no dependent independent binary. We are interdependent from childhood on. And if we could get rid of this idea that asking for help is somehow one person's doing all the getting and the other person's doing all the receiving, people love to help people, and it gives our lives meaning. And we need to get better at asking for help and receiving it gratefully and without shame. Shame.
Yes. All right, so I am running long, and I got to just check to see if we run long. Are you going to be good if we add a few more minutes?
Sure.
Because I'd really like to give people the opportunity to ask questions, and we haven't even yet gotten to the work that you're doing with the global anti-ageism movement. So do you want to open up for questions and then come back to the movement, or where do you want to go next with this?
You're driving. I'm not driving.
Well, let's see what the questions are.
Yeah, let's see what people have to say.
What they're saying, and then come to the movement.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. So I'm just going to type in the chat box, type your questions here, and it would be interesting, I think, if you started your question just by letting us know where you're watching this from. But we did have one interesting question from Rachel Dreyfus here in Fairfield. She's wondering, are there cultures that do this right, that treat older people and talk about aging well or better?
Well, there's no right or wrong. I think part of sort of our Western, very white, very achievement-oriented culture doing and being is like there's a right way to do it, and we have to age in a certain way. And that's the whole dogma behind there's actually a whole like thing called successful aging. Like Aging is not something we succeed or fail at. It's a line in my book. If you wake up in the morning, you are aging successfully, which is a bit of a gag, but really if what you want to do and it's all you can do, or you can afford to do it, or what you feel like doing is sitting on the porch swing, more power to you. You know, I think we have this rosy idea that somewhere to the east, there's a place where older people are venerated and it's all just nifty. It's true that in countries with a tradition of ancestor worship, or where people live in smaller communities that are more mixed age, some indigenous cultures, they do, you know, hold their older members in higher respect. But everywhere there is capitalism, industrialization, fragmentation of families, those forces, you know, are you know, propel ageism. So it depends place to place. It's worth thinking about the fact that cultures like the early, I told you I was skeptical to start with. When I read a book about aging in America, and read that in early America, in, you know, colonial days, it rocked to be old. And I couldn't imagine, like, it was a good thing to be old. Well, there weren't a whole lot of old people. Older men, you know, held the power, shocker. And when you have a gerontocracy, which is a society where old people hold the power, those are lousy societies in which to be young. Right? You have to wait till the old people die off. You don't inherit unless you stab your older brother. What we don't want a society where older people are put on a pedestal or where younger people are valued. We want equity across the lifespan. And that's a global challenge. Sorry, this is a really long answer, but you know, population aging is a new demographic trend. It is permanent, it is global, it is here to stay. It has happened in the blink of an eye. And we are making this up, right? It's not all ageism. Roles and institutions have yet to catch up, which is what gives us an incredible opportunity right now. That was a bit of a soapbox. I mean, here's one more data point. In the Paleolithic era, that's when our ancient ancestors evolved long enough to have 3 living generations. And that is when art happened. That's when music happened. It's called the grandmother hypothesis, a little sexist, sorry guys. You know, in your and my lifetimes, 4 and 5 living generations are emerging. Think of what that could bode, you know, access to the social capital of millions more healthy, well-educated adults than ever before in human history. Kaboom.
Thank you. Yeah. We're just waiting for some more questions to come in. I don't know, Mark, if you want to continue with.
Well, yeah, I would love to hear more about what is going on with the movement. I know that the World Health Organization just made a huge announcement.
Yeah, that was so nice. I was remembering that when I heard the TED Talk, that there was a reference to the World Health Organization. On March 18th of this month, they launched, and this is the actual name of it, not my fantasy name for it, the World Health Organization's global campaign to combat ageism. Because they realize that the biggest obstacle to making the most of these longer lives is age bias. And it's a fantastic campaign. They talk about changing the way we feel, think, and talk and act about ageism. So it's really, because all change does start within our ears. The most important first step any of us can embark on is to think about our own attitudes towards age and aging. And it is very exciting to not only to say that a global movement to end ageism is underway, but to be able to point to evidence, because I am an evidence girl. When we started the Old School Clearinghouse 3.5 years ago, it was just like 3 of us, just seemed like a good idea. We were sort of astonished that it got the instant pickup that it did. We didn't even have a campaigns section. And again, the URL is oldschool.info. That is now one of our fastest growing sections. These are not campaigns about how to be healthy. They're not campaigns about how to live forever. They are campaigns about how to raise awareness of ageism and what we can do about it. And even since the World Health Organization happened in March, that my own New York City just launched its own anti-ageism campaign.
Wow.
With I'm going to be snarky now, but I know you won't mind. It's called Ageless New York, which is the most ageist name because it's all about people, old people appearing not to age. I have a colleague who tweeted that calling an anti-ageism campaign ageless, whatever, was like putting a fire out with kerosene, which it is. However, I hope the commissioner of the Department on Aging isn't listening. Better a really badly named campaign than no campaign at all. See how open-minded I am?
Sorry to jump back in here. We have a couple other questions. Chris Rick from here in Fairfield is wondering if there are any examples of a time when an older person may have successfully changed an employer's practice on ageism.
Oh, geez, that's a great question. I'm sure there are many, many, many of them. I can't speak to it from my experience because I have been self-employed for so long. I did have a fabulous half-time job at the Museum of Natural History as a staff writer, but they don't fire old people, and I didn't work there full time. I would urge you to noodle around old school for those stories because I'm sure they are there. And the more of us, in the workforce who challenge, challenge norms and push back, then we give other people the courage to do the same.
Great. And Chris has just commented, you may have seen that he'll do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a comment here from Kendall Crolius, who's also just in town here, wondering a little bit more about dementia. So her mother is I don't know what the right phrase is, living with dementia, and no longer recognizes her family, but she remembers them. She talks to them about them. And her family's trying to take solace in knowing that she's happy, even though it makes them very sad. And as she says, so is this part of the good news, quote unquote? I'm sorry you are suffering through this, and only you know the truth of your experience. And I have never had to care firsthand for someone with dementia. It does seem to be the case that it is often harder to witness than to endure. I mean, there's some kinds of dementia that are accompanied by horrible anxiety, and that are really more awful. So, it's your truth. There's a wonderful writer named Margaret Gillette who wrote a fantastic book called Age-Wise and has written very poetically about her own mother, who has since died, who was impaired, got dementia in the last few years of her life. And she had a beautiful metaphor of meeting her mother on the islands where her mother was available to her in a way that worked for her. And people also point out, and again, your experience is your experience, so I'm not suggesting that you should, feel a certain way about this, but that the parts of the person where personhood resides, humor, empathy, are not typically what is corroded or destroyed during dementia, through Alzheimer's. And that if I can't imagine how hard it is to do, but if we can let go of the, I'm sure, desperate and certainly anguished desire that the person remains available to us in the way that we wish they were, or that they had been, and can sort of meet them where they are, there are parts of them that are true to the person we always loved. Thank you. I think that's always a beautiful reminder to remember to meet people no matter what, where they are, instead of where we might wish they were.
Yeah, I love that with sort of islands, moving in the water, and yeah.
Yeah. Couple other questions here. One from Pat Dens, wondering if some age bias might be due to the fact that older people tend to have more money than younger folks. This is the question.
Yes and no. There's tremendous, like, okay boomer, which I, by the way, don't have a problem with okay boomer. It is true that wealth tends to accrue over time, but there's also an awful lot of older people living in poverty. So it is really, really important to avoid any generalization. You know, the 1% is made up of rich people, and so is the 99%. So it's really, really important to push back against any old versus young zero-sum framing around that. My generation, I was born in 1952, dead center in the baby boom, we're starting to die off, is engaged in the biggest wealth transfer in history. And this idea, you know, there is resentment of the baby boom for really legitimate reasons. I mean, I lived through 60 years of unprecedented peace and prosperity. It was a great time to be a white middle-class American. And even my privileged white middle-class kids don't have that kind of economic privilege. And you know, that is utterly legitimately reason to resent us and envy us, but it does not make us the enemy, right? It's really important not to fall for old versus young framing in any domain.
Just a couple of comments of people giving thanks to you for reminding us of the facts of aging and how it just
yeah, I'm not a Pollyanna. You will not hear me pretending, you know, eat enough kale, it's all going to be great. Helps to eat kale, helps to be wealthy, you know, but a lot of it is out of our control.
Just want to draw attention to the time, that's all.
Are you seeing any more questions? And because we do probably need to wrap things up, but is there a burning question somewhere in the list?
No. Thank you. I see my friend and ally Dory Gilliam is happily answering that question that I couldn't give a specific answer to. So thanks for that. Yeah, why don't you want to throw me one or two more, Mark or Rob?
I will hand it back to Mark.
Yeah, I think maybe we're at a point where we can wrap up for now, much as I would like to continue for another hour. But I can't thank you enough, Ashton, for making this time available to us and sharing all this information and your wisdom. I mean, and that's exactly what the book is all about. So I urge everybody, get a copy of this book.
I'm laughing because the wisdom trope is another one I really, really try and steer clear of, because thank you. God, I'm such a clod. Thank you for the lovely compliment, Mark. But the idea that older people like automatically become wise is another stereotype. Old age confers experience, but not necessarily wisdom. And some young people are wise too. But thank you. I'm glad you thought that my comments.
How about this instead of wisdom? The sort of for broadening our perspective on a topic that desperately needs it.
It does. And it's so interesting. I mean, it's just the more you know, the more, I mean, because aging is living, it's how we move through life.
Yes. And in fact, that was the thing that I actually wrote it down. John Leland's idea that you mentioned in the book about we should approach life as an improvisation in response to the stream of events that are coming at us. And that is a very different model from I am the master of the universe and I'm going to try and dominate the world and bend the world to my will and desire. I mean, that's just a completely different.
I mean, it's so elitist. I mean, you see a lot of this, like, you know, this whole life extension movement. I mean, people that really, honest to God, like people living today who, wait for it, are all, there's one woman researcher, wealthy white men who really think we're going to, you know, solve aging, cure aging. And even if we could, and we don't even understand the basic biology of the cell, but it would be fantastic to understand more about the diseases of aging. Wouldn't it be great to cure arthritis, to cure macular degeneration? But when they frame aging as the enemy rather than disease, yes, as the enemy, they increase the barriers to their work being funded and respected, right? The issue is discrimination.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. On that note, I am just going to close us out, as I often do, with a favorite mantra. And this is now closing out, unfortunately, the spring season of speakers. So we won't be gathering again until September. probably with the new slate of speakers. But as we do wrap up, and Peggy will come on in a second to walk us out, I just want to say, may you be happy. May you be well. May you be safe. May you be peaceful and at ease until we meet again. Thank you so much, Ashton.
It has been such a privilege to have Ashton Applewhite with us here tonight, the author of This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. What a fantastic opportunity for all of us and for the newly launched Trinity Spiritual Center to host this special event. So thank you, Ashton, for sharing your research and your insights. I won't say wisdom, and your great humor. We have all enjoyed being in the present moment with you. Please stay in touch with us at Trinity Spiritual Center. And to all of our participants tonight, if you enjoyed this offering, come back in September. We've got so much more to share, and we're thrilled to have you with us, and we're grateful for your support. Our programs involve contemporary issues, spiritual direction, and contemplative practices, and we're deeply grateful to Joni Frost and to all those who are with us tonight. So thank you again, everyone, and come back to Trinity Southport and feel the inspiration as we move forward with Trinity Spiritual Center. God bless.
Thank you so much.
And have a peaceful night.